Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 100! Do you hear the like nightingale singing and see the fireworks crackling in the background? No? Oh, well, we'll try that again next time, but yeah, that was all supposed to happen. Anyway, I welcome you to this podcast, and I'm pretty excited that I made it to episode 100. I can't remember actually how long ago I started this. I think 2017, 2018? I think it was 2017. I think we've been doing this for a while. And I have to say, it is, the thing that keeps me coming back is all of you guys. The community out there is just so lovely and wonderful, and I don't know how long it'll go. I don't know if I'll keep numbering episodes. Maybe something new will happen after all this. I guess you'll have to stick around to find out. And I will too, because I don't know. But I do have some fun stuff for the episode today. I had hoped to have a, completed sweater for you for the 100th episode, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this guy, which is Reverb. And I've got a big giveaway. I went into my stash and decided that the 100th episode deserved a good giveaway for you guys. So it'll be a yarny giveaway. I have a call for test knitters for a couple of patterns for shorn yarn that have come in, and we need some test knitters now. We're at the next stage. And yeah, I think, I'm also working on a shawl, but I'm going to hold off on that. It was one of those weeks where I could have finished the shawl or started and finished the sweater, but instead I did a little bit of both, and therefore neither is complete. And I'm guessing that many of you knitters know that feeling. So I've been working on a shawl, and it's been kind of fun to have that as a side project. It was nice. It's kind of like my palette cleanser between sweaters, and then I knew I had to cast this guy on, but I want to talk to you about some of the issues with the cast on and talk to you about how to add that superwash or different yarn kind of liner to a collar. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And since it's the 100th episode, it makes sense to give a shout out to all of you who have supported the podcast with your coffee donations. Thank you so much. Thank you especially to Suzanne, Catherine, Michelle, and Melanie. Huge thank you to you guys. And a thank you to Amanda, Suzanne, Lynn, Diane, and Lucia. You have all donated coffees to the podcast, and I can't thank you enough. And in fact, today's giveaway, I think of it as being sponsored by you guys. So thank you so much for letting me dive into the stash and pull out some fun things to offer to the community. Yeah. If you're interested in the coffee thing, the info is down below in the YouTube info area. It's just a way to, basically donate a couple bucks to the podcast or more if you'd like to, and it helps keep things running smoothly around here, and I appreciate all of you who have done that so far, so thank you so much. Let's jump in with some knitting, math, and interesting kinds of construction questions. How about that, right? So this is our 100th episode, and this is a podcast where we do a lot of garment modification, DIY, and garment construction kind of stuff. So that's what I figured we should do today. And nothing could be better than having a sweater in progress that I could do that with you guys. Like I said, this is the Reverb cardigan by Tanis Ravelry, and that's Tanis Fiber Arts. And this is actually, it kind of goes along with our make-along for the year, which is the Out of My League make-along. Things that we thought we might never be able to knit, or that at the time, they seemed too hard for us. This isn't quite one of those patterns, but in a way it is, because I think it was one of the first patterns I ever favorited on Ravelry, if you can believe that. So if I look back on my favorites, I think this one is from 2012, 2013, like right after I started knitting. I absolutely loved it. It's a beautiful cardigan. I'll put a little picture up here, hopefully, so that you can see it in all its glory. It came out in Brooklyn Tweed's Wool People volume, like really early. And actually, I remember following Brooklyn Tweed around back then and finding a lot of their patterns to be really inspiring, and the work they were doing, and with all the wool, and learning more about 100% wool and where wool was produced and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, thank you, Brooklyn Tweed, for your introduction back in the day. And this pattern has been in my favorites, like I said, since 2012 or 2013. So yeah, it's kind of good to just pull it out and get it done. And I'm actually knitting it. I didn't have this yarn set aside for it. This is the Brooklyn Tweed Shelter yarn, and this color is actually Faded Quilt. I think you can see it up there, but I'll pull out a skein of it. So this is the Faded Quilt colorway. It's my mom on the, we were FaceTiming the other night, and she said it looked gray to her, but it's a little bit of a blue. It's kind of like a steel blue gray, kind of. I think Faded Quilt is actually a pretty good it's like the backing on a quilt. You're getting the color pretty well there, I think. That's pretty accurate. And so Shelter is kind of like the worsted weight cousin of Loft. So if you've ever used Loft, and I was talking about Loft with my last sweater with Flight, because it's a fingering weight yarn and it's woolen spun, as is Shelter, and so it does break fairly easily, the Loft does. I found Shelter to be really easy to work with. Shelter is very much, even though it's a woolen spun yarn, it's still pretty darn sturdy. And I'm not finding issues with breakage with this one too much. I mean, if you really tug on it, you can get something, but that seems pretty good to me. So I am knitting it in the yarn that the pattern calls for, but this is yarn that I picked out maybe a month ago when I decided to finally knit this sweater. So yeah, way to go Brooklyn Tweed for like keeping things going for the last 10 years and still producing a yarn that I could use for the sweater that was called for in the pattern. Awesome. I like the longevity and the kind of staying power of some of these 100% wool American made companies. I think that's kind of cool. So I am going to tell you a little bit about the maths and the problem with casting on and why it took me so long to cast on this sweater and why I needed a palette cleanser between the last one and this one. So when I started swatching for this sweater, I was in the middle of the Flight sweater, and I had swatched for that one 3 or 4 times. And in the end, as you'll recall from the last episode, the Flight sweater ended up coming out, still I was aiming for a bust size of like 37, 38. It came out as a 40. So I was a little bit, it was one of those post-sweater moments when you're like, wow, I've knit a lot of sweaters and yet, gauge can still kick my butt, right? So because of that, and because the gauge swatch that I did for this sweater did not come out a gauge, but I liked the fabric, it took me a little while to want to cast on, given what happened the last time. So like I said, palette cleanser, shawl, no gauge, wonderful, garter stitch, lace work, mosaic, it was wonderful, and it's almost done, and I'll show it to you next episode. But this guy was going to be extra tricky because I was getting 17 stitches to the inch, or to 4 inches, instead of 20 stitches to every 4 inches. So if you go to project pages, sometimes you'll hear people talking about getting a different gauge than the pattern, and instead of re-gauge swatching or trying to get gauge for the pattern, they actually just go up or down a size, depending on what's going on with their gauge. So in my case, like I said, I was getting 17 stitches to 4 inches instead of 20, so I figured I'll just go down 1 or 2 pattern sizes. Then instead of knitting the 38, I'll knit a 34, and because my gauge is 17 stitches over 4 inches, I'll actually end up with something that's a little closer to like a 37 when you do the math. And I have a whole video over on YouTube, on the channel, on sweater math and how to kind of calculate things. But the basics are, if my gauge is fewer stitches to those 4 inches, so 17 instead of 20, if you can go down a couple pattern sizes, it'll usually work out. And you can do the math to do the conversion, to double check if there's a schematic in the pattern. You figure out how many stitches you're going to get per inch, you figure out how many inches you want, and then you see whether or not one of those lower pattern sizes would kind of match up with the numbers that you're getting. So in my case, it worked out just fine. It seemed like I would go with the lower, I went 2 sizes down, it seemed like it was going to work out. But then I started getting all fancy and decided I also wanted to add that kind of superwash turned collar to this sweater. And I've done that before. I talked about it in the last episode. It's one of my favorite things to do. It just makes sweaters with collars sit really nicely, and it makes them comfy. And this sweater in particular, a lot of people talked about the fact that the collar, it's a top-down sweater, that the collar is actually a little bit floppy, and they didn't really like that so much. You can kind of see that the material for this, if it were a single layer, doesn't have a whole lot of structure to it. I mean, it does because it's wool, but when you put the weight of 2.5 inches of collar there, it gets a little floppy, right? So I thought for a couple of reasons I was going to add this superwash layer. But the superwash I chose, which I absolutely love, this is a Sweet Georgia sock weight. This is their Tough Love sock. And I've got the wrapper over here, the tag. This is a Sweet Georgia Tough Love sock in the color Evening. And this was from their last, I think this was one of last year's seasonal colorways. It's this beautiful dark blue. And I just kind of knew that it would match up really well with this kind of slaty gray that was going on. So I wanted to use this. But here's the trick. Usually I try to do this with the same weight yarn because then it's easy. You just cast on the same number of stitches. You don't really have to worry about gauge too much. Yeah, so with a fingering weight to a worsted weight, that's going to make a difference. So I also, in addition to figuring out the gauge thing, needed to figure out how many stitches I was going to do for this inner collar. It slowed me down. I'm just going to say the day job has been a little busy lately, and after coming off the last sweater, I was like, I'm working on a shawl, and I'll find a weekend morning when my brain is fresh, and I'll do this then. So that's what I did finally, and that's why it's taken me a little bit longer to get this sweater started. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the choices that I did end up making with the inner collar, and some of the ideas for how you might do this for your sweaters if you're interested. So I purposefully left it unstitched so that you'd be able to see it. And I wanted to talk to you about a couple of the different options for doing this kind of thing. So the sweater is supposed to, as I said, have just this simple ribbed collar top down. You add a certain number, or you cast on a certain number of stitches, you knit your ribbing, you come down here and transition into the front panels, the back, and the raglan sleeves that you're going to be growing by increasing, right? Now, there's something a little funny about this sweater that you guys might have noticed. The collar is awfully small. That's the other thing here. There are all these little fun things about this. The collar is very small. It really only sits around the back of the neck and a little bit up the side. So I started reading ahead in the pattern, which is something you have to do if you're going to do modifications. And I realized that the reason the pattern calls for such a small collar is because the button bands that go on the front of the sweater are about 2.5, 3 inches wide. And they are sewn separately. They're knitted separately and sewn on. Did I say that right? They're knitted separately, vertically, and then sewn on. So what that means is you've got these other choices to think about. So normally with a sweater, if it weren't a top-down sweater, you would work your way up. You'd have the entire sweater knit, and then you would add the collar at the end, let's say. And then after you added the collar, then you would add your button bands by picking up along the front seams and one at a time, and you'd knit usually horizontally to create your button bands. Right? We're together so far? So, like I said, with most, let's say, bottom-up sweaters, even some top-down sweaters, you wouldn't knit the collar or the button bands until after everything was done. But this sweater called for the collar to be knit in with the body, and that complicates things. So there are a couple things that I noticed that you could do. And some people did in their pattern pages, project pages, talk about just casting on extra stitches and literally adding the button bands into the garment. Like as you knit down, you're just knitting the button bands as well. And I kind of wish I had done that, but it was such a complicated thing at the time that I just decided to let that part go. But all of that is to say that collars and button bands are often integrated into sweaters in different ways. So you have to consider how the pattern is integrating those elements before you do your modifications. So when I'm just going to focus on this modification here. And the way that I chose to do this was one of two ways I considered. The first thing I considered was casting on the number of stitches that were needed at the bottom of this collar so that I could basically knit the entire top of the sweater without the collar, and then later go back and pick up stitches and add the collar, because that's a simple thing to do. At that point, you kind of know how many stitches you need to pick up. It's relatively straightforward, and you can put in your turn row and add your liner at the top of your collar, because you're working bottom up at that point, right? I'll show you here. So you would pick up stitches along here, you'd knit this way, you'd put your turn row in, and then you'd continue knitting with whatever other yarn you wanted to use. And if you were gonna work with like this, a lighter weight, a fingering weight yarn, you would need to increase your number of stitches so that it would come out even and not pucker in and be funny, right? So that was one thing that I considered doing, and I've done that before with a lot of collars. So the alias sweater that I talked about last time is that kind of sweater where you basically knit the body of the sweater top down, Then you pick up your stitches and you knit up for your collar. And it just, you know, seemed like a simple solution for adding that liner. But I decided to do it the other way, just because this is a top-down sweater and I wanted to experiment. So what I ended up doing, as you can see here, and I'll unbutton this so that you can actually see what it looks like. I cast on for the superwash liner first. See that? So it folds down. I decided to cast on for this first. The best way to do this would be a gauge swatch to figure out how many stitches per inch you're at, so that you would know approximately, you know how wide this thing is and you know how many stitches you need. Gonna go that way. What I did is I did swatch because I was thinking about using this yarn for another project. So I had a couple of swatches in my bag. And I went back to the project that they were for, and I saw what kind of needles I probably used, and I did a kind of quick measurement of how many stitches per inch, and then I used that to guesstimate how many stitches per inch I would need to cast on for this liner. It worked out pretty well, and you can see I knit this in rib. Kind of see that in the light. So it is ribbed all the way down. And then what I did is I experimented with a bunch of different things. The thing that worked the best was to, in this transition, you can see this transition here, it is a purl row, a turn row, and I wanted to make sure that the lining wouldn't necessarily show from the other side. So you see that? So what I needed to do was make sure that as I was knitting, I worked one row with my worsted weight yarn into my fingering weight yarn without doing anything to reduce the number of stitches. And then as I worked the purl turning row, that's where I did my reductions. And I needed to go from 72 to 52. So I needed to get rid of 20 stitches, which was a stitch about every fourth stitch or so as I went along. So those are the decreases that I did, and I wanted it so that the ribbing wouldn't just disappear and look weird. But you can see that there's a slight difference in where my ribs are relative to where the other ribs are, but it's not something that you would notice too much once it's all folded together. So that was the strategy I used. And right now I wanted to leave it all apart so you could see. It appears that it's a little bit short, but it's superwash and it just stretches right out to the edges of that collar. Now this is a pretty short collar, and short by short I mean in height, so it's about 2 inches, I think, maybe 2.5 inches. And I think I might have preferred it to be even taller than that, but at the same time this seems to be working out right now, and it kind of works with the aesthetic of the sweater. If I hold it up, I think it's about the right kind of height. And the nice thing about this, like I said, the extra added bonus is that because it has this inner layer, it doesn't flop when I hold it up. It's just kind of a little more structure to it, and it's going to stand up a little bit better on its own. Now, the thing about adding the button bands to the front of this is that the button bands will not have the liner you know, at the back of them. But I'm okay with that because I don't need a liner for the front of, you know, for the entire collar. And the front is usually going to be a little bit open right here. You're not going to necessarily button it all the way up to the chin, you know. You're probably going to have it buttoned somewhere down here, and that's going to be just fine for an opening. The nice superwash part that's going to be against my neck is going to be just fine and plenty long enough for this sweater. So that was one modification that I did, and I wanted to walk you guys through that a little bit because there are a couple ways to do it. Like I said, you could have just picked up stitches right around here, whatever that stitch count is in the pattern, worked the rest of your sweater, and then worked the collar from the bottom up. Would have been fine. But as you can see, you can also work it from the top down, and you can work it with 2 different weights of yarn, from a fingering weight yarn to a worsted weight yarn, or vice versa if you really wanted to. So lots of fun stuff there. The other thing that I ended up doing with this sweater is that as I got knitting on the raglan increases and working the back cable panel, which I think you can see there, it's quite beautiful. I mean, the Reverb is a great name for this sweater. It really does kind of undulate back and forth. But once I started doing all of the cable work on the back and the front panels, I thought to myself, you know, Going down 2 sizes might not be the most ideal thing, and here's why. The thing to remember about almost all over cables is that they're gonna pull in, right? So even if my gauge swatch was 17 stitches instead of 20 per 4 inches, and even though that would normally mean I could go down a size or 2 and end up with about the same bust size in the end, say a 37 or 38, in this case, it wasn't gonna quite work that way because the only stockinette portion is this little part underneath the arm here and same on the other side. So I looked at the numbers, I looked at how the sweater was coming out, and I decided to actually go with the original size. I know, right? So I ended up doing the increases until I was gonna be at the original size, at the 38-inch bust that I was originally gonna do, rather than staying with that 2 sizes lower, like the 34-inch bust. Does that make sense? And the reason for that is just that these cables are going to shrink everything a lot more than you think. So I didn't swatch for the cables. The pattern only calls for swatching in stockinette, which I did. And the stockinette portion is fine, but it's really only about half the sweater. So you gotta consider what those cables are gonna do to the fabric and how they're gonna pull in. So I'm actually really happy with this. And luckily for me, I have a mannequin that's about my size, and I threw it on some waist yarn once I got to the underarms and saw that it was gonna indeed be absolutely fine here. It looks a little bit small right now because these needles are constricting it. It's gonna actually go out farther than that. But with a 3-inch button band on each side, it's gonna sit just kind of perfectly with a little bit of ease. So yeah, it took a lot of brain power, sweater math, anyway, to do all that figuring. And I'm actually really satisfied with the result here, and I'm excited about the way that this addition of the collar happened with the top-down work, because that was something new to me. And yeah, I guess I will be able to tell you even more about the sweater in the next episode once it's all finished up. But this is Reverb by Tanis of Tanis Fiber Arts. And if you guys have questions about modifying collars, adding superwash liners, modifying math for different patterns or cable patterns or different gauges and things like that, I'd love to hear your comments and questions, because as I've said before, I'm working on a modification class, and it will be done eventually. And this is one of the things that I think is kind of interest to knitters, like how do you change up sweaters and successfully kind of make choices about what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're going to do it. So leave me your comments below, and I will do my best to work those comments and questions into the modification class as I put it together. All right, the next segment is a call for test knitters. So I'm calling all of you out there who like to test knit patterns, because I've been working on Shorn 3, and as many of you guys know, I've been putting out the Shorn yarn for a few years now. This is our 3rd batch. It is a fingering weight yarn, beautiful Corriedale Teeswater kind of mix blend, and it comes from local Illinois producers. So this time it's from Kathy of Seven Sisters Farm. And I put a call out for designers this year. Instead of working with a specific designer, I put a call out in general, and I got wonderful responses from so many of you. And I selected 2. One is Lori, who's putting together a hat pattern that I'm actually tech editing this weekend. And the other one is Amy Engelbrecht Wiggins put together a pattern for the As Seen on Wikipedia socks. So these are the socks that were knit up by her mom, Beth Engelbrecht Wiggins. She is a very fast knitter. And you can see there's a beautiful cable pattern on the upper part, kind of standard heel flappy, and standard kind of toe down there. There you go, round toe. And it is beautiful. There's a beautiful, intricate kind of pattern in this cable that I absolutely love, and I'm trying to get it to show up on this sock form. There it is. You can see these adorable kind of squares that work their way down the front of the sock. So Beth knit these up, and this is the Shorn yarn, and it's been so interesting. This is the Shorn yarn before it was washed. I know the camera's kind of blowing out a little bit, but I think you can see that the color change is quite amazing. This is the unwashed, this is the washed version. And even in the unwashed version, you can see those beautiful squares kind of popping. So this is Amy Engelbrecht Wiggins' sock pattern that she put in for Shorn, and we need test knitters for these. And she also took the pattern from the socks and turned it into a beautiful mitten pattern. So you can see the same cables up and down, beautiful thumb. And these are the fingerless version. Beth is knitting up the full mitten version, and so we'll have those soon. But if you're interested in test knitting either fingerless mitts or mittens, and or the sock pattern, if you love cables and fingering weight yarn and you have some in your stash and you want to get involved, we would love to have you involved in the test knit. So please send me an email at knittingthestash@gmail.com, and I will put you in touch with the designer and with Beth, who is going to be running the test knit over on Ravelry. So it should be a fun test knit, and all you need is some fingering weight yarn. I think one skein of fingering weight yarn would absolutely make both socks, and a skein of fingering, you might even need just half a skein for the fingerless mitts. I think that might be where she's at. All of that info is over on the Ravelry thread, so you can check that out there, and send me an email and I'll put you in touch with those guys, or you can just go straight on the Ravelry thread actually and talk to Beth directly about getting involved in the test knit. They'll be selecting a certain number of folks for that test knit, and then coming up soon, we'll also have the test knit for Lori's beautiful hat for Shorn 3. So I'm just getting really excited to see this yarn turn into actual things and accessories in the world. And yeah, I hope you guys are getting kind of excited about it too, because it is gorgeous. I have to just say, I love these. I love the fingerless mitts, and I love that beautiful, intricate, but fun cable pattern. Email me if you want to get involved. We would love to have you guys in the test knit. All right. So since this is our 100th episode, woohoo! Once again, fireworks are going off somewhere. I have a giveaway for you guys, a very yarny giveaway. I jumped into my stash to pull out some fun stuff that I thought you guys would appreciate. So let me show you what it is. And what we're going to do is I'm going to draw 3 winners for this squishy yarn prize. And the 3 winners have to be, unfortunately, in the United States still because of the pandemic. I can't get over to the post office quite yet. Almost. We're getting close. So if you're in the United States and you want to be entered to win any of these beautiful yarns for the giveaway, all you have to do is leave me a comment below and tell me what you're hoping for this summer. Like, what are you looking forward to? Is there a particular book you want to read? Is there something you want to knit? Is there a hope that everyone that you know will be vaccinated and you can like hug your grandkids? Whatever it is, I want to know what you're thinking about this summer, even if it is just laying out in the sunshine and like reading a good book or knitting a shawl, because that sounds pretty good to me. So leave me a comment below, or over on the Ravelry thread, or on the blog, and I'll enter you to win one of these 3 prizes. Yay, yarn, right? Okay, so first up, I've got some beautiful, this is Finn wool that I purchased from Feederbrook Farms. It's about almost 4 ounces, and it is a beautiful kind of variegated skein. Lisa over at Feederbrook Farms does some amazing work with Finn sheep, BFL. Last I checked, she had Icelandic as well. It's a really beautiful farm, and I'll put links to her, all her info over in the show notes, which are always on the blog, knittingthestash.wordpress.com. So this is a 4 ounce skein, a worsted weight of a beautiful Finn, 100% Finn from Feederbrook Farm. Pulled that one out of the stash. That one's hard to let go of. I love the colors on that one. It's so pretty. I also have a Miss Babs yarn skein here. This is Yummy 2-ply, which is a 2-ply fingering. It is 100% superwash merino, 400 yards, and it's in the Bat Bleep Crazy colorway. I'm not going to say it and ruin the YouTube for children. So it is a family show. So it is Bat Bleep Crazy, and it is a Babette, so it's a one-of-a-kind skein, I do believe. When I bought it, I think that's what it was. It's like maybe not one of a kind, but at least a kind of an oopsie a little bit. I think not quite their normal, one of their normal colorways or something like that. Anyway, it's beautiful, and it is a really fun kind of variegated skein. So that is another prize. And the last prize is 2 skeins of Audlin Woods DK. This is the 80% merino, 10% cashmere, 10% stellina, and each of these is 250 yards. A little sparkle in there. Would be great for like a little baby things or maybe a cozy scarf. It is a really pretty color. It's very soft because it has the merino and cashmere in it, and it is very beautiful. So this is the Adeline Woods by Knit Crate Twinkle DK. A couple skeins of that to give away. So like I said, leave me a comment, tell me what you're hoping for this summer, whatever that is, simple or elaborate or whatever, and I will enter you to win one of those 3 prizes. So thanks for celebrating my 100th episode with me, and I wish you all so much good and happy knitting. I hope you can find vaccines if you want them. I hope you stay well in the meantime, and I will see you in a couple of weeks, hopefully with a completed Reverb sweater and a shawl to show you, and I'm looking forward to catching up again with you. I guess it'll be toward the end of April or May. All right, see you guys. Take care.